For thousands of years, one parable has been told that has been translated into so many different languages, and not only that, it's changed and morphed in different cultures. We heard the story of the blind men and the elephant, right, as a classic parable. Originated in India like 2000 BC or something like that. And the parable goes like this. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So they sought it out, and when they found it, they groped about it. In the case of the first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another one, whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of a fan. As for another person, whose hand was upon its leg, said, "The elephant is a pillar like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said, "Elephant is a wall." Another, who felt its tail, described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating the elephant is that which is hard, smooth, and like a spear. We could see this here, right? There's one of my favorite YouTubers. He calls his channel "Three Blind Men and an Elephant." I like that. But here it is. This is the parable that we have here, and it's really a parable about perspective. As we consider perspective, we often, as we're trying to search for the truth about things, we have a certain perspective. And as this parable has gone out throughout the world, there's been different spin-offs that have happened in different editions. One that's interesting is the men start to accuse each other of lying about what they're feeling. And because they can't even comprehend that, like, it's so different. And so they actually start fighting each other and start getting violent with each other. And it's supposed to be a parable. This is how wars start. And another version, a man who can see comes along and says, "Hey, you guys are all like not seeing this. You're all partially right and you're all partially wrong. And if you could just see the whole elephant, which I can, but you can't, then you would know that there's a bigger perspective that you guys need to have." Now, as we look at Job 32 and 37, 32 to 37, we come to the speeches in Job's story of Elihu. Elihu has been experiencing from the sidelines the whole scene of the book of Job. And we've been talking about this scene, right? First, a few weeks ago, we talked that there's this big window into suffering that we get on the first couple of chapters of Job, where God has been essentially holding the angelic world accountable. And they come and present themselves before him, and one who is part of that is Satan. And Satan, as he's going to and fro, the Lord says, "Hey, have you considered my servant Job?" And he's like, "No, have not." And so God starts to talk about the blamelessness and righteousness of Job. And then what is Satan's reply? He only loves you because he essentially has these good things. Take them away and you'll see that he's going to curse you. And so what happens? God takes away his 10 children. He takes away all of his wealth because Job was so wealthy and so prosperous, right? And was so regarded and revered in his community. And so what happens? Satan does. He takes all that away, and yet Job's response is the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then the same kind of iteration happens. There's another accounting of all of the angels. Satan comes to account before God, and then God, what does he do? He says, have you considered my servant Job, who you wanted me to essentially, wreck his life for no reason and and condemn the guy unjustly. Have you considered him? And see, he hasn't cursed me. And then, oh, well, he has his health. Take his health away, right? And so what happens? Go ahead. You can do anything you want to him, but don't take his life. So he's struck with boils, right? So all of a sudden this injury is added to all of this hurt in his heart, and now he's kind of repulsive to people, and he's kind of now an outcast of sorts. And the boils are so hard and they're oozing that he's got to find sticks to scratch himself with, as he's sitting there mourning. And what does his wife say? Hey, just curse God and die, right? And he says, woman, that's the way the foolish talk. Shall we not receive good from the Lord and not evil? And so then Job's friends come, right? His Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad. So that'll be on the test, right? And they come along and they start to moan with him and start to weep with him. And they spend 7 days just sitting there in his presence, just with him. And then as soon as Job starts to open up, and we talked about this last week, he starts opening up about his grief, then his friends start to interject with him. And there's 3 rounds of these interjections. Job will talk, then each of these 3 friends have their say, and then there's another round. Job will talk, and then these 3 friends have their say, and he's responding in kind. And then we see that as he's going through this process of grief, his friends are not very helpful. And they're essentially saying, this is your fault. You must have done something wrong. God is not unjust to just do this to somebody for no reason. So you must have done something. So they're condemning him. And all the while, Job's maintaining his innocence. And as that's happening, Elihu, the younger man, has been sitting on the sidelines, and now he's ready to step into the scene. And it kind of is like an interlude before we actually get to hear from God himself. And what I think this exercise from Elihu is about is it's about our limited perspective, similar to this blind man and an elephant. And this is our big idea this morning, is that it is wise to embrace the limits of our perspective. It is wise to embrace the limits of our perspective. And if nothing, this is what Elihu does here, is he punctuates the limits of perspective that we as people, we as humans, especially here in this situation, have regarding things that we know nothing truly about in God's timeline and from God's perspective. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at the ways in which this is punctuated throughout the story. And so we're going to start by considering the frustration of our limitations. There's frustrations to our limitations. And if you look at chapter 32, you see this right off the bat. Chapter 32, verses 1 through 5. So now Elihu steps to the scene and he says this in Job 32, 1 through 5. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job. I'm sorry, this is the narrator here. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, and the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's 3 friends because they found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, he burned with anger. Right, so this guy is just sitting there stewing, right? And have you ever been in one of those conversations and watched as a debate's happening and you're just sitting there going like, oh my God, these guys are idiots. I cannot believe what they're saying, right? And it may have been that Facebook comment, that somebody has. Can I get an amen? Have you seen the debates online these days? Have you read a comment section? And it's almost this endless cycle of like one perspective, another perspective, and then you're both wrong, right? That just happens over and over again. And that person debates another person, and then you're both wrong. And it just keeps adding, and no one's listening to each other because comments are flying furiously because somebody said, it's pronounced tomato, right? And then all of a sudden the world erupts because they can't handle, no, it's tomato. Even now, you're like, I'm going to scream if I hear that word pronounced incorrectly, right? And this happens, right? Our patience is very limited, along with our perspective. So we can get very, very frustrated with this limit as we go into it. And this is exactly what's happening with Elihu. He is raring to go into this, and he's got to speak up. So chapter 32, verses 18 to 20. For I am full of words. The spirit within me constrains me. Behold, my belly is like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. I must speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. He's got to say something. He's been watching the ignorance of Job and his friends, and now he's got to address it. And I think this kind of preface here to this interlude helps us to maybe understand that what we're about to get with Elihu may not be all that wise, may not be all that foolish either. And maybe it's just an additional mediating voice here to maybe balance things out. It's not this way or that way, and also it's not another way. So there's not just between two parties, but it's now there's a third party. And he's frustrated with the limited perspective of Job and his friends, but I think as we can all attest to, it's very much easy to see the flaws in others than it is the flaws in ourselves. Right? It's the blind spot factor, isn't it? Right? Big blind spot. And right here, is it possible that Elihu is setting himself up for his own blind spot here? Right? We know this from James chapter 1, that it's good to listen. Right? James chapter 1, verses 19 to 20 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak." Right? Slow to speak, right? Slow to anger, right? For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So I think this tells us a little something, right? Not to say that Elihu doesn't have a righteous anger and that he's sitting here going, wait, man, where's God in all this? You guys are just sitting here, you know, you're totally poo-pooing Job here, like you're condemning the guy, but you're not even sitting here dealing with his arguments. Like, deal with his arguments. So he's been holding this in, right? And so there's a frustration to our limitations. Then we start to see kind of the second aspect here of punctuation of our limited perspective. To be older does not guarantee that you're wiser. To be older is not to guarantee that you're wiser. And so I think Elihu points this out well if we look at verse 6 of chapter 32. Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. So Elihu's frustrated because he's seeing people who are much older than him, who should know better, who've got experience. And guess what? What's he seeing? Foolishness. He's seeing that just because you're older doesn't mean you're wiser. And matter of fact, you know, just sometimes part of growing older is that, and we do the same things over and over again, or we're trapped in our own experience, is that if we haven't embraced the limits of our own perspective, all of a sudden we start to diminish other people's perspectives. And maybe that's what's happening here. Job 32, 12 to 16. This is really where he gets to it. He says, I gave you my attention, and behold, there are none among you who refuted Job or who answered his words. Beware lest you say, we have found wisdom. God may vanquish him, not a man. He has not directed his words against me, and I will not answer him with your speeches. They are dismayed, they answer no more, they have not a word to say. And shall I wait because they do not speak, because they stand there and answer no one? This movie called Pulp Fiction has one of my favorite lines in there. There's a little dialogue. There's two kinds of people. Those who talk, those who listen and those who wait to talk. So let me ask you here. Is Elihu here somebody who is patiently listening, or do you think this guy is just eager to talk? What do you think? Seems like it, right? Now, it's like there's he's timid, so he has been listening here, but there's this sense where like, all right, gotta step in, right? Now, let's real talk here. How many of you have read through the book of Job? Okay. How many of you are just aware generally of the story of Job and know how, obviously, we talked about it, right? So you may not have read every little part of this, but for those of you who have engaged in Job, before, Elihu kind of comes to the table, what are your general reactions have been to Job and his friends? What have been your thoughts thus far? What do you think? Yeah, Lee.
That they've adopted a very it's very entrenched in Middle Eastern culture to be very fatalistic, and so God there's a very strong Muslim belief that if something happened, God willed it, and that the fact that it happened means it has God's blessing. So the Holocaust,
right.
Because it happened, it had God's blessing.
Right. Right.
And so and bad things happen to bad people, and so possibly that fatalism is creeping in. Also just a general sense of jealousy because of well-off people.
Right.
And they're
totally.
they're it's like, well, finally that guy got what coming to him.
Right.
Because he was so he's so much more wealthy than us.
Right.
So much more, holier than thou.
Right. Right. Yeah. What are some other responses? What have you been feeling through this dialogue between Job and his friends? Yeah, Megan.
They're just not really gracious or compassionate people. I think self-righteous kind of comes to mind a little bit. They know exactly what he's done wrong.
Right.
But instead of looking at it like, wow, this horrible stuff has happened to you, let me be your friend, they're pointing fingers.
Right. Yep. Anybody else?
It seems to me like they're the fix-it mindset, like fix-it mode. They just want to tell them, here's the answers, and kind of the same thing, but it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
When someone's in a process, struggling through it, to just rush in and say, well, here's the answer, confess your sins, and all of a sudden, go out, tell them you're a dirty, rotten sinner, and all of a sudden everything's just going to be fine again.
Yep.
Which, can create more stress because you're trying to figure out if you don't know what you did, like Job.
Yes.
He probably already went through that stress,
right.
limiting himself and going, this is just more stress.
Yeah.
I don't even know what I'm supposed to be guilty of here, and he's being honest with himself.
Right. He is.
Yeah.
Rob, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, although I think
you can go first.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But I think part of it too is building off that fix-it mentality he was talking about. Is they're coming at this situation like they have all the answers. They have this idea that because he's a prophet, he must be in sin, and so they think Job's just trying to save face. They think he's lying, and they think he's being prideful, and so they're trying to rebuke him. And it may not all be coming from a noble place. Maybe some of it is fostered from that jealousy they might have had as well.
Yep.
But some of it, they might just be thinking he's lying. But at the same time, too, I think Job in this moment, you were talking last week about how he was going through different stages of grief, and like he kind of opens up with that depression.
Yeah.
Of like,
Right.
and like a lot of times, that mindset of like depression and sadness and misery, we view that as so negative to the point where, if somebody's exhibiting that, oh well, then they're just wrong. There's something wrong with them. We just gotta fix it. And sometimes people just feel what they feel.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Scott.
So since we're talking about perspective, I'd like to offer a different one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Job's friends were really actually genuine. I mean, they sat there for 7 days and did nothing. I mean, we can't even sit for 7 minutes or 70 minutes for that matter. 7 days they sat with this guy and just kind of commiserated with him with their mouths shut. I think that's a testimony to actually that they were friends.
Not to mention, but he willingly prayed for them after the fact.
Right.
So they meant something to him.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but I think they were really wrapped up in a cause and effect, right, as it pertains to a human being. And what they really did is they forgot about the providence of God. And they just correlated everything that was going on in what they see themselves in their perspective of humanity, effect, punishment or suffering, cause sin.
Yeah.
Instead of what they were lacking was a bigger perspective of what, of the fact that God was involved in all this.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I would have been any different, but I
Right.
don't think that their motives were as cynical as some other thoughts on that, other perspectives.
Sure. And I think there's here's what's fascinating about the book of Job, right? The book of Job is included in the wisdom literature genre of this is poetic, right? This is eloquence. You're not going to see this kind of poetic eloquence other than like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or maybe like Paradise Lost, or some other there's some big epic poems out there. This is the scriptures. Right? This is and it's old. It predates all of those. So it's fascinating in that regard. So part of that is in this kind of a tale, this kind of a story with Job's experience, the thought is, how do you discern? Right? That's what wisdom's all about, is discernment and discerning things. And what's happening is that the author is helping us to see the big picture and the big perspective, setting us up for a limited perspective that now we have to be very cautious about, because we don't necessarily know. We have to sit here and go, is that right? I don't know if that's right. And so we have to apply our own discernment in order to figure this out. And part of this is what are the biggest truths that we could actually base our opinions on. And so here, they're trying to grasp for things that they understand, but yet they're also ignoring some other things. And this is a discernment exercise. That's what it really is. And Elihu, we're going to see how he's doing in this, right? And so here he's looking, going, yeah, those old friends aren't really helping. But it's funny because his criticism of them is that you're not refuting him. Notice his criticism is you guys aren't really being comforting. How come you guys aren't asking more questions? How come you? This is interesting. It's fascinating, right? So I think part of that. That's why I want to hear, because we all have our own responses to this whole dialogue. I remember the first time I listened to Job, or read through Job and these friends. I mean, I was just sitting here going oh, that's a half truth, and oh, that's not all the way right, and oh yeah, that's a great point. How come you're not listening? So it's fun because Job is inviting us. It's inviting us to think along this process with him. And so, but a big takeaway here, and this is really helpful, is to consider that the youth aren't necessarily foolish. What's a text in the New Testament that helps us with that? Yeah, Rob.
Let no one despise you because of your youth.
That's right. He told to Timothy. Yeah, and Lee. Yeah.
The character Elihu, the
Yeah.
fact that he exists in the narrative,
Yeah.
makes me think that Job was written by a younger dude.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a young person had to have his say, right? But yeah, that's right. Paul told Timothy, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers, right? So we can see that there's some wisdom here to what he's saying. So perspective doesn't mean you have all the perspective when you're older. It just means you have a little bit more experience. Third, way in which we understand our limited perspective here is that ignorance can lead to self-justification. Ignorance can lead to self-justification. And when we've been wronged or when we feel like we're being attacked, it's very quick for us to justify ourselves. And we have to explain ourselves such that we can say, hey, listen, I'm right here, or I'm certainly not wrong. And so part of what's happened here is them not knowing where this kind of suffering comes from, particularly Job. His trigger is leaning towards self-justification. So it's something to be aware of. So Elihu points this out. Elihu turns his frustration to Job because there's so many statements that Job makes about declaring his innocence. Job 33, verses 8 to 12. It says, surely you have spoken in my ears, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure without transgression. I am clean. There is no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasions against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths. Behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Right? And listening to Job is an exercise in wisdom because although Job maintains that he did nothing to deserve his current situation, he never declares himself sinless. Notice that. That's very important. So we have to stick to the text as we're following through Job, because the text is going to say things that are even contradictory to each other, but we also got to be careful to not say what it doesn't say. And Job never said here that he'd never committed a sin. He's just saying he'd done nothing worthy of this particular suffering. So that's very, very important. And Elihu is rightly concerned about the urge that Job has for self-justification. And he sees that, and even the narrator helps us, that he's justifying himself rather than God. So it's not to say that he's condemning God or cursing God, but he's definitely going in a direction that may lead him down that path. That kind of seems what Elihu's saying. We get this in Job 35, verses 2 to 8. Do you think this to be just? Or do you say, it is my right before God that you ask? What advantage have I? How am I better than if I had not sinned? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. And then he says later in Job 37, verses 23 to 24, he says, the Almighty, we cannot find him, is great in power, justice, and abundant righteousness. He will not violate. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. So he's right here in a certain sense that people who think that they're right in their own eyes, right? This is a proverb, right? Now you're starting to hear proverbs come into Job. They're all over the place. All these pithy wisdom statements. And now we're sitting here going, oh yes, right? A man who considers himself wise in their own eyes is despised by the Lord. We see that all over the place. So Elihu is saying, you got to just be careful here, right? And he warns Job, and I think this is critical. He warns Job, who seems like he's stuck, just like Rob said, he's stuck in bitterness. He's stuck in a depression, maybe even anger, if we go back to anger. And if you linger in anger, that can lead to bitterness. And if you stay in bitterness, guess where that's going to lead you? It's going to lead you to cynicism and scoffing. In Job 36, he says, verses 18 to 21, this is what Elihu says. He says, beware lest wrath entice you into scoffing. It's a great warning. Beware lest wrath entice you into scoffing, and let not the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Will your cry for avail to keep you from distress, or all the force of your strength? Do not long for the night when peoples vanish in their place. Take care. Do not turn to iniquity, for this you have chosen rather than affliction. And what Elihu seems to be doing here is he teeters on a warning to an actual condemnation. And that's kind of the tricky part of Elihu here. He kind of says, well, don't beware, but you've already done it. You know what I mean? That's kind of not helpful, right? So this is part of this discernment process. But at least we can say that ignorance, right, or our limited perspective, or ignorance can lead us to self-justification in the midst of our pain and our suffering. So, and I'd say not just even there, but everywhere. We are prone to self-justification. We are prone to a works-based system. And this is kind of what Satan was getting at in the beginning. That the human tendency is to justify ourselves according to some level of works. And so you owe me, God, if I'm obedient. You owe me, God, if I've done something. And so this is where I think Elihu has some good caution, although he may go over the edge himself here. Kind of the fourth kind of punctuation mark of our limited perspective is not seeing the wisdom of God's eternal perspective. God has an eternal perspective. At one point, if we think about this, and this, again, will fry our brains, it'll bake our noodle, God doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have a beginning. He just is. There's no one who created him. There's no one who brought him into existence. He just is. And that is hard for us to wrap our heads around and wrap our minds around. So if you think about it, for eternity past, we'll call it, his perspective is the perspective. There is no other perspective. He created all other perspectives because he created all people. That's power. And there's wisdom to that. Isn't that incredible? In Job 33, this is part of what's happening here is Elihu is helping them to understand part of this. Again, he himself is bound. He's got his own issues here, but here he says in Job 33, verses 14 to 22, he says, God speaks in one way, and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn aside from his deed and conceal pride from a man. He keeps back his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with the continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread, and his appetites the choicest food. His flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen. His bones that were not seen stick out. His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. It's really weird here. But what's Elihu saying? Like what's Elihu's kind of big idea here about Job's perspective maybe? God speaks in many ways. What are some ways he says he speaks here? You guys remember? Dreams, visions, right? He may come and speak this way, or he can speak in pain. And what's happening here is what Elihu's saying in Job 33 is that God can bring pain to discipline and teach us. This is interesting, right? So essentially what he's saying that there may be another alternative here. It may be to prevent sin, not just to, some payment for sin. It's very interesting here. So what he's saying is there may be, God has reasons for bringing pain. Now, this doesn't apply to Job. It doesn't seem like at all. But yet that's an interesting perspective to have because he's thinking like, man, the Lord has all kinds of reasons and Maybe here's some ways in which the Lord can do that. So this, again, part of thinking about God's wisdom and his eternal perspective. Job 34, we start to see that he's like, no, dude, you got to understand, God's always right. Right? The classic debate, right? Is God always right? Yes, he's always right. And so in Job 34, verses 10 to 13, we hear this. Therefore hear me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to the work of a man he will repay him, and according to his ways he will make it befall him. Of a truth God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice, who gave him charge over the earth, and who laid on him the whole world. What's Job saying here? What's Job saying? God's always right. God's always right. Now, again, Elihu, in his own limited perspective, doesn't mean that he's right about everything he's saying about God. But he's right that God is always right. And so he's trying to uphold God's rightness and righteousness. And if you think about it, it's not necessarily too much different than what Job's friends had been saying, but he's trying to say, let's think about how this, is it possible? And I think this is part of what he's doing. He even says at one point, Job, I'm trying to help you be justified, in a sense. Is it possible that what God is doing is he's 100% righteous, and yet Job is still innocent? I think he's still holding those things here. And what Elihu seems to be saying is, it's not that Job is suffering for his sin, but his reaction to his suffering looks like it's sinful. Does that make sense? Sin didn't get him into his suffering, but while he's suffering, it seems like he's sinning. So that's different. It's a different perspective. So Elihu can be very helpful here with this. And not only that, he continues, and this kind of starts to set the scene for God to speak up. He's going to speak up. And he's going to ask Job questions. And before he gets there, Elihu starts to set it, right? Anybody play volleyball here? Anybody like to play volleyball? Man, there's nothing like a good setup, right? Nothing like a good set, like a good bump set or a good nice set, right? So someone can just come and spike it. And I think that's what chapters 30, 36, and 37 are kind of like, particularly 37, where Elihu starts to talk about the majesty of God and the grandeur of his creation. And we get it in words like this. Job 36, behold, God is, verse 22, behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way? Or who can say, you have done wrong? Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. All mankind has looked on it. Man beholds it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water. They distill the mist and rain, which the skies pour down and drop on man abundantly. In preview to next week, as Scott will actually be sharing and preaching on God's response, does anybody know some of the things that God's going to talk about? He's going to talk about dinosaurs. Yeah, right. What else? Yeah. Leviathan, right? And the behemoth, yeah.
Yeah, he's gonna, like, the creation of the world.
Right.
Events Job just wasn't around for.
And what's that point to? Points to God's eternal, wise perspective, right? So, now knowing all of that is helpful. Knowing all of that and seeing what Elihu has to offer has its place, I think. Limited in his own right. Sometimes he comes across as the guy who's, I can see and you guys can't. Sometimes he's coming across and going, I think that this leg is a pillar, right? So it goes back and forth sometimes, I think. But here's what's incredible about this limited perspective, is that God, even though he has an eternal perspective, you know what he does for us? He changes our perspectives through the gospel. What's fascinating what's fascinating is that Elihu was just like Job's friends that turned to condemn Job. Not his suffering, not for his suffering, right, but his response to his suffering, which may, again, like we said, may not be the most helpful of things, although it may be true in some regards. And so this is what Elihu said in Job 34. He said, "Men of understanding will say to me, and the wise man who hears me will say, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like wicked men. Whew. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God." Ooh, Elihu, you're sounding like Zophar, Bildad, and Eliphaz. He's starting to condemn Job. But here's what's interesting, is that Elihu, in Job 33, imagines what it would be like if a mediator would be appointed by God to redeem and help man know his way. It's fascinating. Job 33, verses 22 to 28. Anybody want to read that? Anybody got that? Job 33, verses 22 to 28. Yeah, Rob, you got that? Sorry, I know I'm flipping around and we don't have it up on the screen. Yeah, what's verses 22 to 28? Job 33.
His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000 to declare to man what is right for him. And he is merciful to him and says, Deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become flesh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then man prays to God, and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light.
That's Job. This is the book of Job. This is not the New Testament. This is a huge gospel clue right here in the book of Job. It's awesome. Elihu is essentially imagining that as God brings people into pain, so much so that they go down to the pit, that there could be a rescuer, that there could be another mediator or a mediator. And he uses the language of a ransom. What's a ransom for? What does a ransom do? If we think, what's that? It's a debt, right? If we think of Israel was ransomed by God out of slavery, redeemed, right? Ransomed out of slavery in Egypt. And what was the cost of redemption to Israel or for Israel? It was the slaying of the firstborn, wasn't it? That was the cost. And instead of their sons paying for this, who paid for it instead? The Egyptians. And the substitute was provided to Israel how? Sacrificial lambs. And what happened? They poured the blood on the doorpost so they could be redeemed from the pit. Right? And this sets us up, and this helps us to understand that who Jesus is God stepping in to skin to actually take on our perspective. This is incredible. God became one of us so that he could see from our perspective. And he could experience all of the pain and all of the suffering in all the day-to-day life. He could be here, he could hear it, he could sense it, he could smell it, he could experience it himself. This is awesome. This is awesome. Because what we have all throughout the pictured in the scriptures is that God isn't distant. God isn't unknowable. And this is where we are. We actually have limits to our perspective, but God doesn't. And he can go all the way in, and he's got a way for us. 1 Timothy 2, verses 3 to 6 say it so beautifully. This is the Apostle Paul. He says, speaking about prayer, praying for everyone, praying for kings, praying for magistrates, praying for all the people in our lives. He says that this is good and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who God gave himself as a ransom for all, which is the testimony given at the proper time. Wait a second. Mediator and ransom. Where did we see that? In Job 33. Is it possible that Paul is literally using the language of Job to help us understand who Jesus is? Elihu has some wisdom here, even though he speaks not of it, his limited perspective. He has no idea. He's actually talking about Jesus as a category for us. This is awesome. God became one of us to have our perspective. So guess why? Guess what he wants to do with that? He wants to give us his perspective. This is what the scriptures are all about. This is what the Spirit of God is all about. This is what eternity for us is all about. Is that he came to see from our perspective so that we could see from his perspective. And this is where wisdom is, friends. It's seeing things from God's perspective. And it's bought not because we've earned it somehow, not because we've justified ourselves. It's because God has showed up. And what's awesome, and this Scott's going to talk about this next week with God appearing to Job. Here's what's just absolutely fascinating. The whole book of Job is set up, the book of Job is set up by this premise that all of the angelic world presents themselves to God. Isn't that crazy? The premise starts with accountability, that people have to answer to God. And yet, as this whole story unfolds, and Job encounters what he encounters, and he has not sinned in order to get any of this stuff, you know the courtesy that God does? God is the one who presents himself to Job. Isn't that incredible? And what's that setting us up is that Jesus would present himself to us, for us, in our place. That's the ultimate perspective. That's where we're going with all of this. And I don't know what you're all going through. I don't know what all your perspective is. And you know what's awesome of what the gospel does? It helps us to get over the limits of our frustration. The frustration of our limits. It helps us to see the freedom of our limits. Because he's got it, I don't have to worry about it. That's awesome. And it may be that you just got into an accident. It may be that you just lost a job. It may be that you're about to lose somebody or have lost somebody. It may be that that relationship is struggling. It may be that you have a business that you're trying to get off the ground. It may be this future that you're going into and school is going to start for you. It may be that you got your license now and now you're ready to go to the next. There's all kinds of perspectives that we have, and we come from different stories. But what binds us together, what helps us to see that our perspective is limited and embrace it even, and see the freedom of it, is that we know one who is the one who has sight and can go, here. I'm not going to sit here and point out all of the wrong things because there's too many to be named here. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to die for them. That's what he does. So that ultimately, in the end, we're going to see from his perspective and gain what is true wisdom. So let's pray. We need to pray about this. We need his wisdom, don't we? for what we are facing, what's ahead of us, even this afternoon. So let's pray and ask the Lord's help.